In 1994, the Maplewood Motel stood on the edge of a quiet Ohio town, the kind of place people pass through without much notice. It wasn't fancy, just a faded roadside stop with flickering neon lights and peeling wallpaper. But that year, it became the backdrop of a story that no one has ever been able to explain. A man signed in late one evening under the name of John Miller. He carried no bags, had no car, and paid in cash. To the motel clerk, he seemed polite but distant, and there was something unsettling about his empty hands and lack of belongings. He requested a corner room at the far end of the hallway, far away from other guests, and when he was handed the key, he disappeared down the corridor without another word. The next morning, housekeeping staff unlocked the room expecting to find an unmade bed, a towel on the floor, maybe a half-empty soda can. Instead, they walked into a space that felt unnaturally empty. The bed was stripped as if someone had carefully taken the sheets and blankets with them. The drawers were bare, the closet door wide open, and the trash bin spotless. There wasn't a single trace that anyone had ever stayed there. Even the small complimentary soap and shampoo were missing. The strangest part was the smell. The faint scent of bleach lingered in the air, though the motel didn't provide any to guests. Confused, the staff checked the logbook and confirmed the man's name and signature. They checked the surveillance system, which only covered the parking lot and front entrance. On the tape, the man could clearly be seen entering the motel at 11:47 p.m. His expression unreadable, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. But there was no record of him ever leaving. No car pulled up, no figure walked back through the lobby, no shadow slipped out through the side door. He had gone in, but never came out. Police were called, and their initial assumption was simple. Maybe the guest had slipped away through an emergency exit or a back window. They searched the room thoroughly but found nothing unusual. No footprints, no fingerprints, no fibers. They even pulled up the carpet and unscrewed the vents, looking for any sign that someone had tampered with the space. Nothing. The walls were solid, the windows sealed, and there were no hidden doors. Yet the man was gone, and with him, everything he had touched. The case quickly drew attention not just from locals, but also from nearby towns. Reporters arrived, eager to cover the story of the motel guest who vanished without a trace. The owner of the Maplewood Motel, terrified of losing business, closed off the room indefinitely. Guests who stayed near it claimed they heard faint noises at night, a soft dragging sound, or a creak that seemed to echo from inside the locked space. Some even said they smelled bleach seeping out from under the door, though the room hadn't been cleaned since the day of the disappearance. As weeks turned into months, investigators continued to search for leads. They looked for anyone matching the name John Miller, but the ID he had provided turned out to be fake. The name was common, and records showed no clear match. No missing persons report matched his description either. It was as though he had walked into the motel from nowhere and vanished back into it. Rumors began to spread. Some believed the motel hid a secret passage built long ago and forgotten by the owner. Others whispered about something darker, suggesting that the room itself was cursed, capable of swallowing a person whole. Skeptics dismissed the case as a simple runaway, someone who wanted to erase his identity. But even they couldn't explain the missing sheets, the spotless trash bin, and the surveillance footage that showed no exit. Years later, the Maplewood Motel shut down, unable to survive its reputation. The building was eventually demolished, but those who watched the demolition swear that when the final wall of the corner room came down, the scent of bleach filled the air once again. And though the structure is gone, the land remains empty, avoided by locals who still talk about the man who walked into a room and never came back out. In 1977, the quiet farmlands of Iowa carried on with little disruption. Families tended their crops, neighbors waved from tractors, and the rural stillness gave the impression that nothing unusual could ever happen there. But one autumn morning, smoke rising from the chimney of the Whitford farmhouse caught the attention of neighbors. At first, no one thought much of it. The Whitfords were a hard-working family of 5, and their chimney always carried smoke when the air grew cold. Yet, after weeks passed without anyone seeing them in town, concern began to grow. The mailbox outside the farmhouse overflowed with letters, and the yard, once neatly kept, began to look abandoned. Finally, a neighbor decided to call the police. When officers arrived, they expected to find either an ill family or perhaps a household that had left town in a hurry. What they walked into was unlike anything they had ever seen. The front door was unlocked, and the smell inside was faintly sour but not overwhelming. The dining room drew their attention immediately. Around the table sat the entire Whitford family, 2 parents and their 3 children, each positioned in a chair as though frozen in the middle of supper. Their faces were calm, their bodies undisturbed. Before each of them sat a plate of food, untouched and now long spoiled. Candles burned into pools of hardened wax, and every clock in the house had stopped at precisely 8:47 p.m. There were no signs of a struggle, no spilled drinks, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. The family looked almost staged, as though someone had carefully arranged them to sit in silence for eternity. Autopsies revealed no poison in their systems, no wounds, no illness that could explain such a sudden and simultaneous death. Their hearts had simply stopped beating without warning. Authorities checked the home for carbon monoxide leaks or chemical exposure, but every test came back clean. The furnace was working normally, and there were no toxins in the air. Investigators tried to piece together the family's final hours. Groceries in the kitchen suggested they had gone shopping just days earlier. School books left on the counter indicated the children had done their homework. Everything pointed to a perfectly ordinary evening that had ended in something extraordinary and terrifying. The unanswered question haunted everyone. How could an entire family perish in perfect unison without a trace of violence or explanation? News spread quickly, and the Whitford farmhouse became a source of fascination and dread. People drove miles just to catch a glimpse of the place where time had stood still. Local churches whispered about curses while skeptics searched for rational answers. Some suggested rare natural causes, perhaps an undiscovered gas or sudden heart failure brought on by shared shock. Ugh. But those explanations fell apart under scrutiny. Nothing in the medical records of the family hinted at such vulnerability, and scientists who examined the site confirmed no dangerous substances had been present. As months turned into years, the farmhouse fell into disrepair. No one wanted to buy the property, and locals avoided it altogether. They claimed strange sounds echoed from inside, faint laughter, the creak of chairs moving, or the muffled scrape of silverware. Others swore they saw faint light flickering through the dining room windows at night, as though candles were still burning on the table. Whether it was imagination or something unexplainable, no one could say. Eventually, the county boarded up the house, but the legend of the silent farmhouse refused to fade. Even now, decades later, people who pass the land will slow their cars and glance toward the boarded windows, wondering if the Whitfords are still there, forever caught in the moment of their last supper. For some, the farmhouse is just a mystery. For others, it is a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying crimes leave behind no culprit, no evidence, and no answers, only silence. In 2002, the city of Chicago was already accustomed to crime stories, but none of them prepared residents for what became known as the Music Box Murders. The first case began quietly, almost unnoticed, when a young woman was discovered in her apartment with no signs of forced entry. She was lying on the living room floor, her expression peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep. What unsettled investigators was the small wooden music box placed neatly on the table beside her. When wound, it played a haunting lullaby from the 1800s, a tune most officers had never heard before. At first, police thought it was nothing more than a bizarre personal belonging, perhaps left by the victim herself. But within weeks, another body surfaced, and another music box was waiting at the scene. This time, it was a middle-aged man in a downtown condo, found in almost the exact same way. His front door was locked from the inside, no valuables were missing, and no fingerprints were present. The box beside him played the identical melody. It was at this point investigators realized they were dealing with something unusual. Both victims lived in entirely different parts of the city and had no known connection to one another. The only link was the eerie presence of the music box. As the cases multiplied, fear spread quickly. Each victim seemed chosen at random: men, women, young, old, wealthy, poor. The city grew restless as news outlets labeled the unknown killer of the Lullaby Man Detectives worked tirelessly, trying to trace the origin of the music boxes. Some were antique pieces from Europe, others appeared to be custom-made, but all carried the same haunting tune. Forensic teams dusted every surface for fingerprints, and in one breakthrough, a partial print was discovered inside the lid of a box. When cross-referenced, it matched a man who had died 2 decades earlier in a car accident. The discovery made no sense, and officials quietly dismissed it as a mix-up or contamination of evidence. Yet the unease within the department grew. The investigation dragged on, and no suspect was ever caught on surveillance cameras. Strangely, none of the victims' neighbors ever reported hearing the melody before the bodies were discovered. Some claim they noticed faint music echoing in the air, but when they investigated, nothing was found. Detectives began to wonder whether the killer carried the music boxes with him, leaving them behind like a signature, or whether the boxes appeared after the crime was already done. One of the most chilling details came years later when officers conducting an internal review went back to check the stored evidence. Every single music box from the case files was missing. Locked cabinets that had been sealed were suddenly empty. No one had signed the evidence out, and security footage showed no one entering the room during the nights they disappeared. The official explanation was poor record keeping, but those who had worked the case knew better. The boxes had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. The murders eventually slowed, then stopped altogether, leaving behind only unanswered questions and terrified whispers. Families who lost loved ones never received closure, and the melody of the lullaby still echoes in their minds. For some, it is nothing more than an urban legend now, a story used to frighten children into locking their doors. But for those who followed the investigation closely, the absence of answers is worse than any explanation. How could someone kill so many without leaving a trace? How could evidence point to the hands of the dead? And why that same haunting tune? The music box murders remain one of the most disturbing mysteries Chicago has ever faced. For the families, the sound of a lullaby has been forever stripped of comfort. For the detectives who worked the case, the melody still lingers in memory, an unsolved riddle that refuses to fade. And for those who hear the story today, one question remains. What would you do if a strange music box appeared in your home, playing a tune from a time long gone and waiting quietly by your side? During the mid-1980s, construction crews in New York City were tasked with expanding part of the subway system. It was meant to be routine work, digging, clearing, and reinforcing old foundations. But when their machinery broke through a wall of concrete, they discovered something that would never appear on official maps. Behind the wall was a narrow tunnel, long and winding, descending deeper beneath the city than anyone expected. At first, the workers thought it was just an old service passage, abandoned and forgotten. But as their flashlights pierced the darkness, the truth became far stranger. Lining the ground were belongings, hundreds of them scattered across the dirt floor. Children's toys, small shoes, purses, wallets, even watches. Some were decades old, worn and broken, while others looked almost new. When cataloged, many of these items matched descriptions from missing persons reports filed across several decades. Parents who had lost children, families who had mourned vanished relatives, suddenly found traces of the belongings they thought were gone forever. Yet, chillingly, there were no bodies, no bones. Only the things people had carried with them on the day they disappeared. The tunnel itself seemed unnatural. Its walls were crudely carved, not in line with city construction. It stretched for miles, weaving in directions that didn't match the planned layout of subway blueprints. It ended in a wall of thick concrete, as if someone had deliberately sealed whatever was beyond it. The concrete was different from the city's own building material, poured with a mixture no one could identify. Officials ordered the area sealed again, but whispers began spreading among the workers about what they had really uncovered. Forensic teams scoured the soil in the tunnel, and what they found was unsettling. Microscopic traces of human remains were embedded in the dirt, enough to prove that people had once died there, but not enough to explain where the bodies had gone. This led to theories that whoever had used the tunnel had taken the victims elsewhere or destroyed the evidence in ways investigators couldn't imagine. Yet no tools, no machinery, and no footprints were ever found. The passage was silent, empty, and heavy with unanswered questions. Rumors spread quickly, both among city employees and the public. Some said it had been the work of an organized group, perhaps an unknown cult or criminal ring who had used the tunnel to hide their victims. Others believed something far stranger had happened underground, something the city refused to acknowledge. Theories of experiments, secret communities, and even urban legends about creatures living beneath the streets circulated. The more authorities tried to suppress the story, the more it grew until people refused to walk certain streets above the tunnel for fear of what lay below. Eventually, the city sealed the entrance with reinforced barriers, claiming it was unsafe for workers. But insiders reported that the closure happened far too quickly, as though someone higher up wanted the discovery buried. Years later, former employees admitted they were told never to speak of it again. Official records made no mention of the tunnel, and the belongings cataloged from it were quietly stored away in evidence rooms, rarely discussed. Families of the missing were left with more pain than closure, holding items that had once belonged to loved ones but receiving no explanation of how they ended up underground. To this day, the forgotten tunnel has never been reopened. Urban explorers whisper about hidden entrances still existing, sealed behind false walls or beneath layers of cement. Some claim to hear strange noises near those locations, distant echoes that sound like voices calling in the dark. Whether the tunnel was the work of human hands with sinister intent or something beyond comprehension remains unknown. What is certain is that beneath the bustling streets of New York lies a place where countless lives left only their belongings, swallowed by a passage that was never meant to be found. In 1999, a small-town police department in rural Texas stumbled upon one of the strangest cases it had ever handled. It began with an auction of abandoned storage units, a common event where forgotten or unpaid spaces were sold to the highest bidder. One unit in particular caught the attention of officers when a man who won the auction opened it and immediately called the authority. Inside, stacked in neat rows from floor to ceiling, were hundreds of VHS tapes. Each was carefully labeled with dates and addresses, some stretching back more than a decade. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a personal archive, but the reality was far more disturbing. When investigators played the first few tapes, they were shocked at what they saw. The recordings showed ordinary families in their homes, unaware they were being watched. Parents cooking dinner, children playing in backyards, couples arguing quietly in living rooms. It was all captured in grainy, silent footage. The angles suggested hidden cameras had been planted inside homes, sometimes in bedrooms, sometimes in basements. Other tapes were recorded from outside, showing families through windows or watching their routines from a distance. It became clear that whoever had made the recordings had been stalking dozens of households for years, documenting every detail of their lives. Each tape included handwritten notes. Some were chillingly specific, detailing when families left for work, when children walked to school, and what time doors were usually locked at night. Others contained maps of neighborhoods with certain houses marked in red. The stalker seemed to know everything. Schedules, habits, vulnerabilities. Even more unsettling, several of the addresses matched families who had reported break-ins, missing pets, and in some cases, unexplained disappearances. The discovery set off panic across the county. Families demanded to know whether their homes had been watched, and officers scrambled to review as many tapes as possible. But before they could fully investigate, something unexplainable happened. Just days after the tapes were brought into the police evidence room, every single one of them disappeared. The cabinets where they were stored were still locked with no signs of tampering. The officer assigned to guard them swore he saw a man carrying boxes out during the night, but when questioned further, he admitted that no one else was in the building and security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned at the exact same time. The disappearance of the tapes destroyed any chance of solving the case. Without them, there was no way to track the stalker, no way to connect the crimes, and no way to prove what investigators had already seen with their own eyes. Officially, the case was listed as evidence lost due to mishandling, but those who worked inside the department knew it was more than that. Someone had taken the tapes, someone who didn't want the truth revealed. Whether it was the stalker himself reclaiming his work, or someone within the system silencing the investigation, no one could say for certain. Over time, the story faded from headlines, but the families involved never forgot.